Every empire begins not with soldiers, but with symbols. For the last 70 years, one symbol ruled the world: the dollar. It didn't conquer by force, it conquered by habit. It became the language of trade, the permission slip for progress, the invisible leash around Africa's dreams. From Cairo to Lusaka, every shipment of gold, every sack of cocoa, every drop of oil had to pass through one door: Washington's. But last week something extraordinary happened. No tanks, no speeches, no protests. Just a quiet click: a new system came alive. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or COMESA, quietly launched a digital payment platform allowing 21 nations to trade with each other directly in their own local currencies. No dollar, no middleman, no approval needed. It was not rebellion for the sake of defiance. It was logic restored. Because if the value is created in Africa, why should the price be approved in America? For decades, the world told Africa it was too poor to decide its own worth. But on an ordinary Thursday morning, Africa decided otherwise. It built a system that doesn't ask for permission, it creates its own trust. The border is no longer a financial wall, it's a digital gate. And now the question that once haunted this continent has returned to the entire world. What happens when Africa no longer needs the dollar to trade? Will the old powers allow a new order to grow, or will they fight to keep control over the currency of obedience? Stay with me until the end, because this story is not about money. It's about freedom written in code and how a quiet revolution may have just begun under your radar. Please share this video if you believe Africa deserves the right to trade in its own language. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. On an ordinary Thursday morning, while much of the world's financial media looked elsewhere, something revolutionary unfolded inside a quiet conference hall in Lusaka, Zambia. There were no flashing cameras, no headlines screaming, "Africa breaks free." Yet that's exactly what happened. Representatives from 21 nations stretching from Egypt to Zimbabwe pressed a single digital switch that could change the course of the continent's economic history. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, known as COMESA, officially launched the Digital Retail Payments Platform, DRPP, a system that allows African nations to trade directly with one another in their own currencies. For the first time in living memory, a Kenyan coffee trader could sell beans to a supermarket in Malawi and be paid in Kenyan shillings. A Zambian maize exporter could complete a deal in Kwacha. A manufacturer in Egypt could buy raw cotton from Ethiopia without a single American dollar crossing the transaction. This was more than technology, it was philosophy in motion. For decades, African trade moved through an invisible tunnel. Goods flowed out, dollars flowed in, and value leaked away. Every time an African farmer exported maize or gold, the payment had to be converted into U.S. currency, processed by foreign banks, taxed through intermediaries, and only then trickled back home slightly diminished. That system wasn't designed by accident. It was engineered to keep Africa dependent, a system where borrowing meant obeying, and obeying meant staying poor. The new platform flipped that logic upside down. With the DRPP, African nations could now settle cross-border payments instantly, securely, and locally. No conversion, no middlemen, no invisible hands reaching across oceans. It was a quiet declaration of independence expressed not through slogans but through software. And the implications went far beyond money. It was a challenge to the very architecture of global finance. For generations, Western economists called the dollar a neutral tool, a global convenience. But neutrality, as this story reminds us, is often the most deceptive form of control. When your trade is priced in someone else's currency, your sovereignty is rented, not owned. The DRPP changed that equation. It redefined what economic self-determination looks like in the 21st century, not through walls or wars, but through systems that return trust to local hands. The logic was simple but powerful. If Africa can create its own value, it should also validate it. And yet what makes this event even more remarkable is how quietly it happened. There were no bold declarations of defiance, no fiery speeches. The revolution came clothed in calm spreadsheets instead of slogans, code instead of chaos. That's why it caught the world off guard. Because for the first time, Africa didn't ask permission to innovate. It simply did it. Behind this move stands a visionary leadership, especially Kenya's President William Ruto, who currently chairs COMESA. Under his guidance, the bloc invested more than $150 million in its regional financial institutions, signaling a commitment not just to reform, but to redesign Africa's relationship with the global market. As Ruto said in his address, you cannot talk about regional unity while begging for someone else's currency to do business. He was right. Regional unity starts with financial autonomy. The DRPP represents the first time African nations have built a system where their money can circulate freely within their borders and across them a true continental bloodstream. This isn't rebellion, it's recovery, a restoration of reasoning, a reclamation of trust, and a quiet proof that sovereignty no longer needs to shout to be heard. And that's why this event, barely noticed in the Western press, may one day be remembered as the moment Africa began to rewrite the logic of global power. The moment COMESA's digital payment switch went live, the air across the continent shifted quietly but unmistakably. For decades, Africa's transactions had moved through invisible wires stretching from New York to London, where every exchange needed a nod of approval. But now those wires trembled. For the first time, the pulse of trade began beating from within Africa itself. In financial capitals thousands of miles away, alarm bells began to ring. Economists in Washington called it a fragmentation risk. European analysts described it as a threat to global monetary stability. But beneath the polite language of policy, what they really meant was simple. Africa had just escaped the orbit of the dollar. The reaction wasn't immediate outrage, it was quiet panic. Reports from Western think tanks warned that Africa's new payment system could undermine confidence in traditional financial architecture. To the untrained eye, those words might sound neutral. But to those who understand the language of power, they meant something deeper. Control was slipping. The irony is striking. For decades, Western institutions told African nations to modernize their economies, to digitize, integrate, and innovate. Yet when Africa finally built a system of its own, it wasn't celebrated, it was feared. And that's where the story reaches its emotional peak. Across Nairobi, Lusaka, and Harare, ordinary citizens began to realize what had just changed, not through breaking news, but through the subtle transformation of daily life. A small trader in Lilongwe could now send payment directly to a supplier in Lusaka without paying a hidden tax to a foreign bank. A Kenyan farmer selling coffee to Egypt could receive payment in shillings instantly without asking a global intermediary for permission. For the first time in generations, Africans could trade freely not as dependents, but as equals. That's when the story turned from economics to dignity. The border is no longer a financial wall, one journalist wrote. It's a digital gate. Those words captured what millions were feeling, but couldn't yet articulate a kind of quiet liberation. The independence that politicians once promised through speeches had arrived through servers and software. Still, revolutions, even peaceful ones, rarely go unchallenged. Western financial agencies began to issue subtle warnings about compliance, oversight, and security. These were the same words once used to justify control. A new narrative started to take shape that Africa's move toward monetary independence could invite instability. But behind the anxiety was a deeper fear that if Africa proved it could sustain a trusted local multi-currency network, other regions might follow. Latin America, Southeast Asia, even parts of Europe disillusioned by sanctions and currency wars. Africa's quiet code could become a global contagion of independence. That's when the real high point of the story unfolds, not in a headline, but in a single line spoken by President William Ruto. This is not rebellion. This is restoration of reason, of fairness, and of dignity. That statement echoed across the continent like a sermon. It reframed everything. This wasn't about defying America or Europe. It was about redefining logic itself, reclaiming the arithmetic of sovereignty. And just like that, the philosophical fracture became visible. Economists in New York saw danger, but on the streets of Africa, people saw rebirth. From Nairobi's high-tech startups to Ouagadougou's small markets, a generation was watching the impossible happen, a system that doesn't ask for permission, a code that doesn't need validation, a currency that reflects not power, but participation. And perhaps that is why this moment feels almost biblical, a reversal of the old order written not on tablets of stone, but in lines of code. The revolution had no anthem, no march, no flag. Yet it carried the same spirit that once moved nations to independence, the courage to say we can trade with our own worth. Revolutions are rarely visible at first. They begin in numbers, in circuits, in quiet exchanges that slowly bend reality. That's exactly what is happening now across Africa. Weeks after the COMESA digital platform went live, the effects began to ripple far beyond boardrooms. In Lusaka's open-air markets, traders who once had to stash wads of cash for risky currency swaps now use mobile apps to receive direct payments from neighboring countries. In Nairobi's informal settlements, young software developers are building plugins that connect small businesses to the new system. In Malawi, a farmer who once waited weeks for an international transfer now sees the transaction appear in seconds. The system has become more than a financial innovation, it's a social equalizer. For decades, Africa's small enterprises, which make up 80% of the continent's economy, were invisible in cross-border trade. They didn't lack ambition. They lacked access. Without US dollars, they couldn't pay foreign suppliers. Without collateral, they couldn't borrow from international banks. Now, with the digital retail payments platform, that barrier is gone. A soap producer in Malawi, a textile maker in Ethiopia, or a mechanic in Zambia can all trade freely with partners across borders using the money they already have. It's not charity. It's inclusion through design. And inclusion in the African context is political power. For generations, global institutions defined economic credibility by obedience, by how strictly a nation followed IMF prescriptions, or how quickly it privatized public goods. Now, the definition is shifting. Credibility no longer means compliance. It means capacity. The ability to build systems that serve one's own people before serving external interests. That's why this financial transformation is igniting something deeper, a civic awakening. People are beginning to question why their nations ever had to earn permission to prosper. Students in universities from Kampala to Lusaka are debating what digital sovereignty really means. Journalists are describing it as Africa's second independence, not won through flags or constitutions, but through the architecture of trade. And that conversation is reshaping politics. Governments are now under pressure to strengthen local industries, improve internet infrastructure, and invest in education for digital literacy. The people newly empowered by access are demanding more transparency and less dependency. It's a reversal of power that even the most optimistic economists didn't anticipate. For decades, Western donors dictated Africa's fiscal direction. Today, that influence is weakening. As local currencies circulate and regional economies integrate, the leverage once held by foreign lenders begins to evaporate. But not everyone welcomes this change. Some domestic elites whose wealth depended on currency speculation and foreign contracts see their grip loosening. The new system threatens not only international dependence, but internal corruption. Because when every transaction is recorded on a regional digital ledger, the shadows where money once disappeared start to shrink. That's why the revolution is not just economic, it's moral. It's about accountability. And it's inspiring parallels elsewhere. In Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traore, similar efforts are being made to nationalize gold trade and keep value within the continent. From Lusaka to Ouagadougou, leaders are learning that sovereignty is not declared. It's engineered. The results are subtle but transformative. Ordinary Africans, long taught that prosperity depended on permission, are beginning to see a different truth. Power is not given. It's coded. And perhaps that is the most profound political consequence of all. In Washington, the news arrived like a whisper wrapped in confusion. A new payment system in Africa, settling trade without the dollar. It sounded too small to matter until the analysts ran the numbers. 21 nations. 500 million people. A trading bloc stretching from Egypt to Zimbabwe, now capable of operating beyond the reach of the Federal Reserve. Quietly, the dollar's map had shrunk. In think tanks along Massachusetts Avenue, the language shifted from curiosity to concern. Policy briefs spoke of fragmentation of global monetary order risk to liquidity flows and reduced transparency. But behind those sterile terms lay something more human: fear. Not of violence, but of irrelevance. For the United States, the dollar has never just been currency. It's been strategy. Its dominance allowed Washington to project power without troops to sanction, to persuade, to control. When a nation's lifeline for trade depends on your money, you don't need to invade it, you already occupy it. But the COMESA system changes that calculus. It creates what American strategists call a sovereignty firewall, a regional network that can't be easily pressured through sanctions or credit restrictions. In plain terms, it makes Africa harder to control. Some in the U.S. see opportunity. Progressive economists argue that a multipolar financial world could bring stability, innovation, and fairer trade. Others, especially within defense and intelligence circles, see danger. They warn that if the dollar loses its monopoly of trust, America's geopolitical leverage could fade faster than anyone expects. Across Europe, reactions are mixed. France, whose post-colonial influence still lingers through the CFA franc, views COMESA's initiative as an unsettling precedent. Germany and the Nordics, more pragmatic, quietly admire Africa's efficiency, a clean digital network designed with little bureaucracy and no IMF oversight. Meanwhile, China and Russia are watching closely. For Beijing, Africa's new system complements its own digital currency ambitions and trade corridors under the Belt and Road Initiative. For Moscow, it signals the rise of a financial frontier resistant to Western control, a potential ally in the broader effort to dethrone the dollar. Yet perhaps the most profound reaction comes not from governments, but from ordinary observers around the world. In Latin America and Southeast Asia, activists are calling COMESA's system the African model. They see in it a roadmap not to isolation, but to inclusion. And here in the United States, a quiet debate has begun among retired diplomats and old economists, the same generation that once wrote the rules of globalization. They ask a haunting question: what happens when the systems we built start working against us? Because make no mistake, this is not an anti-American movement. It's an anti-dependence movement. Africa is not rejecting the West. It's rejecting the assumption that it must always trade on Western terms. That distinction matters not just for Africa, but for America's own moral credibility. If the U.S. can accept Africa's rise as a partner, not a pupil, this moment could redefine cooperation. But if it clings to control, it may watch an entire continent and much of the global South build a new order without it. History rarely announces its turning points. Sometimes it just changes the currency of trust. Empires rarely die in battle. They fade in silence when the logic that once held them together no longer convinces anyone. For generations, the dollar wasn't just money, it was the logic of the world. It told nations what their labor was worth, what their future could cost, and who had the right to decide. But today that logic is cracking. Not with protests, not with gunfire, but with code. Lines of digital code written by African hands. Across the continent, from Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from the ports of Mombasa to the dusty roads of Bamako, a quiet defiance is unfolding. Africa isn't begging to join the table anymore, it's building a new one. And that is what terrifies the old order most. Because control in the modern age doesn't look like invasion. It looks like dependency disguised as convenience. For decades, the global system worked like an empire without borders. You didn't have to occupy a nation. You only had to occupy its transactions. You didn't raise armies. You raised interest rates. You didn't seize resources. You seized trust. But with COMESA's digital platform, that invisible empire has met resistance not through confrontation, but through competence. Each local transaction in local currency weakens the monopoly of permission. Each farmer who sells without converting to dollars chips away at the foundation of global dependence. And yet revolutions, even digital ones, come with new dangers. The next colonizers will not come with flags. They will come with algorithms. Western tech giants already circle Africa's digital markets, seeking to host, store, and own the very infrastructure of this freedom. If Africa builds the system but not the servers, it risks rewriting its chains in new syntax. That is the warning. And the invitation. Because if the first battle for independence was against occupation, the next will be for ownership of data, of code, of narrative. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore often says, sovereignty isn't declared, it's practiced. And today, Africa is practicing it not through speeches, but through systems that make dependency obsolete. So perhaps the question isn't whether Africa can sustain this revolution. The real question is whether the world is ready to face an Africa that no longer asks for permission. If you believe that Africa deserves the right to define its own future, share this story. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, subscribe and stay with us. Because history isn't being written in treaties anymore, it's being written in code. And somewhere in that code lies the quiet heartbeat of a continent finally learning to trade in its own voice.